This is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. Welcome to our Christmas edition. So today we're only going to have gifts. There will be no lumps of coal. There will be no ugly sweaters in your stocking. We're going to concentrate on the good news. And there's plenty of it actually this week. For starters, inflation went down last month. Can you imagine? It went down, not very much, 0.1%, but still, that's an extraordinary kind of progress we have made. And over 6 months, we're actually below the target rate of 2%. We're down to 1.9%. Again, extraordinary progress. All of this without the recession, without a uptick in unemployment. Unemployment has been below 4% now for a very long time. And I think you have to say it's been a successful economic recovery. And there's some indication that Biden is actually, if not getting credit for it, people's mood about the economy is changing. And we see that in the consumer confidence. We see that in consumer spending. So perhaps by next year, people will come to accept that, yes, the economy is fairly strong. And although not worth complete celebration and ecstasy, at least an acknowledgement that we have come through bad times. Next good fact. The Colorado Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump cannot be on the ballot because under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, he is an insurrectionist. He aided in an insurrection and therefore is disqualified from appearing on the ballot for any office, including the presidency. Well, that is not going to stand. It's going to go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to do what the Supreme Court does, which is in all likelihood, and I wish it were otherwise, will not knock Donald Trump off the ballot. But I think what's significant here is that you had a court over an intensive 1-week period of evidence reach the conclusion that Donald Trump is an insurrectionist. And whatever the Supreme Court does, it's not going to wipe out that finding. And we actually have a court now adjudicating that he did this. And I have to stress that that's a big deal, that we're dancing around all these other legal issues. Does the 14th Amendment operate on its own? Do you need a court ruling? Do you need Congress to act? All of those are almost beside the point, because here you have a court saying he's an insurrectionist. And that is significant. We finally gotten to the point where you can't deny it. You might still vote for him if you're a crazy MAGA person in a red hat. But let's be honest, that's what he did. And I think that in and of itself is some recognition that he is finally going to be held accountable for what he has done. We should also celebrate that I think we'll get a pretty early ruling, if not before the new year, at least shortly thereafter, on the issue of immunity. Remember, Donald Trump has made this argument that he's entirely immune, absolute immunity from anything he did in office. And the Supreme Court is going to hear that one. And if I had to predict, I would say on that score, the Supreme Court is going to hold he is not absolutely immune. Now, they may hold, however, that there's a lesser immunity that depends upon whether he was acting within the defined scope of his duties. That may entail another finding by the lower court and then a return trip to the Supreme Court. What does that mean? It doesn't mean he avoids a trial. It means that the trial may come a few months later, which is kind of bad timing for him, because that would mean he's, a likelihood, the nominee for the Republican Party, and then he goes to trial for serious felonies. So once again, the Republican Party, remember, for all of the caterwauling from Democrats, it's the Republican Party that is at risk of nominating someone who is then convicted of a serious felony. But even before that, I want to call your attention to another case that in all likelihood now is going to be the first one, and that's New York. We should not forget about the New York criminal case. That's the one involves the falsification of business records in order to conceal the payment of hush money. Now, a lot of people have poo-pooed this case. I think for starters, it's absolutely right on the merits and on the law. It's hard to argue that he didn't falsify these records. But more importantly, I wouldn't discount it in the overall political picture. He was attempting to confuse, defraud, mystify, lie to the American people about who he was and what he had done. And had that information come out that he was paying hush money to a porn star prior to the election, it is possible he could have lost in 2016. So this was a big deal. And this was the first instance in which Donald Trump played around with the electorate and tried to win by any means possible. And the fact that he should be held accountable for that, too, is significant. Next month, he's also going to face, once again, Eugene Carroll. Although he's now claiming he's immune from that trial, he's actually been found liable in that case, and he's going to come back for damages. This is the second part of the Eugene Carroll lawsuit. This concerns statements that he made after leaving the White House. By the way, there's no immunity in that scenario at all. So there's lots of litigation, but it all seems to be pointing in the one direction, and that is Donald Trump is going to be on trial a lot next year, and he's going to be held responsible for what he did. Next bit of good news. Yes, Rudy Giuliani was ordered to pay $148 million to those two poor women who were harassed, threatened, maligned for their participation in the election in Georgia. And then, of course, he promptly declared bankruptcy. The good news, again, this is a good news show, he, in all likelihood, will not be able to, as they say, discharge that debt in bankruptcy. And that's because the bankruptcy court allows you to discharge lots of debt, like your credit card debt, like your car loan. But if it's for liability for an intentional tort, which defamation was in this instance, it was intentional falsification of information about these women and the award of punitive damages, which is definitely intentional conduct, well, you don't get out of that. So that means that for as long as he lives, I suspect that he is going to be paying off these women. May not be much because his income may be very far down. But when they go to bankruptcy court, they'll pay off the secured creditors. Then they'll pay off these two ladies before anything else. So I think they will get something. And more importantly, he is going to be paying for the rest of his days. And he will end his life in either in prison or out of prison, penniless and disgraced. And that, as my good friend Rick Wilson says, is evidence of the adage that anything Trump touches dies. And certainly whatever reputation Rudy Giuliani had left is going to die. Next good piece of information. I have actually started, and I'm really just lapping it up, Liz Cheney's memoir. And I highly recommend it to you because it really points out how utterly detestable, weak, dishonest both Kevin McCarthy and Mike Johnson were. And the degree to which they knew what they were doing was wrong, they knew what they were doing was unconstitutional, and they did it anyway to please Trump. Again, it's not new necessarily, but it is breathtaking. And it is confirmation that to their core, these are people who we should never trust with power. We should never give roles, let alone in the Congress of the United States, to. And it reminds us that had anyone of that group in the House leadership and the Senate leadership finally said enough is enough, yes, we're all going to impeach him and we're going to remove him with the caveat that he cannot hold office again, we would be done with Donald Trump. But because these people are cowards, because they thought he would either go away on his own, or because they thought that he would do them some kind of harm if they actually took those steps, he continues to plague the democratic process and imperil our democracy. But the book is very good, very interesting. And it also underscores that for people who have a moral compass, this was not hard. It was so obvious what he had done. It was so obvious he was a threat to the Republic. All of those people knew it, but so very few of the Republicans were willing to do anything about it. And that really goes to the rot of the entire party. And I hope Republicans up and down the ballot lose in 2024. I think there's a very good possibility of that happening. And then at that point, the Republican Party either collapses, completely reforms itself, or something else comes along. Because as a political enterprise that has to have some concern for the national good, some concern for the Constitution, they have failed repeatedly. So let's come back to foreign policy. You say, wow, here comes the lump of coal. Let me offer a few consolations. On the Gaza-Israel war, I actually suspect we are reaching, if not the immediate end, at least the end is in sight for several reasons. First of all, the administration, as it has been doing, is gradually increasing the pressure on Israel to bring what they call the first stage of the hostilities to an end. That is the intensive warfare, whatever bombing is going on. And the bombing has been more reduced because they're fighting in a urban war environment now. So there's outside pressure. There's also internal pressure, largely because the Israeli people are horrified and furious about the fate of the hostages, who we now know were held, and the ones who remain are being held in horrendous circumstances, denied food, denied light, branded in some instances, tortured in some instances, and sexually assaulted in some instances. And the Israeli public is now marching in the streets in tens of thousands, as they were in the democracy protests, pleading with the government to bring the hostages home. And think about what that means. That essentially means that for them, the war is, at this point, a success only if they retrieve those hostages. And that's an important caveat, because if they fight to the last Hamas fighter, going searching for the last guy with the last gun, those hostages are probably not going to make it. So there's internal pressure in Israel to begin to wrap things up. And lastly, frankly, Israel has disrupted a great deal of the infrastructure of Hamas. They've killed thousands upon thousands of terrorists. They have sealed the tunnels. They have removed bomb-making capabilities. So they too are reaching the point that you have to ask, what's the incremental value to them of continuing on in the fighting, at least this stage of the fighting. So I think we have to recognize that none of this would be happening without the administration. And then there's more good news. 10 Americans are coming home from Venezuela because of American diplomacy. These people, 6 of whom were wrongfully held, but they're coming back because the administration got down to the nitty-gritty of diplomacy. And they also got a pledge from Venezuela that so far they have kept, we'll see if they do, that they're going to move towards elections. Maduro, of course, remains in power now, and he has been running the place in a extra unconstitutional manner. So that's good news. Some Americans will be home and enjoying the holidays with their families. So that's a lot of good news when you think about it. Yes, there's problems. Yes, the current Supreme Court has made hash out of abortion rights. Yes, the House of Representatives is being run by a bunch of nihilists and irresponsible characters. Yes, the American people are still, for reasons that entirely escape me, down on President Biden if you look at the polls. But even there, if you look at the last batch of polls, Biden is even or up a couple points. Now, I'm the last person who's going to tell you to put faith in polls. But if you want to play that game, it's looking better for him than it did a few weeks ago, put it that way. So let's look ahead to 2024 with some optimism. The good news is we have it in our power to get rid of Donald Trump, to get rid of this authoritarian movement. We will have a stronger economy. We will have a foreign policy team that is adept, that's respected, and that is working to bring conflicts to an end. And we actually have a court system that, aside from the Supreme Court, is working slowly to hold Donald Trump accountable. So that's worth celebrating. And who knows what else we're going to get in the new year. So from my house to yours, I wish you a very Merry Christmas if you are celebrating. And if you like this program, please give the gift of the podcast to your friends. Tell them Jen Rubin's Green Room can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.